Hello, everyone, and welcome to the latest edition of the Nordic Football Podcast. We're into Season 3, Episode 7. I'm joined by my colleague, Steve Wyss, the Norwegian expert. How are you, Steve?
I'm fairly stiff, my old friend, actually. I made my seasonal cricket debut yesterday, so I'm rather feeling it today, you know.
In a bit of pain there, and welcome to the show, Steve. And my name is Jonathan Fadugba, and I am the man for all things Sweden. Steve, we're going to go right into it this week. We're not even going to mess around at all. We're going straight into listeners' questions. We're going to mix things up this week. I'm going to start you off with a bit of a curveball by a friend of the pod, Neil Baxter. We're going to kick it off with some questions. This week's show, we're going to talk about the latest goings-on in Norway and Sweden. But we're also going to delve into a special round of fantasy football discussion with the summer break coming up and both leagues online rumbling on and quite nicely. We're going to have a little dedicated fantasy section. We're also going to talk about some transfer rumours, and we're going to have a quick recap on the best players and the latest round of both leagues. Steve, we've got the summer break coming up at the moment, so we'll touch on that in a minute. But I'm going to start you off with Neil Baxter's question. He says, have Rosenborg finally got into some form? And is it worth climbing on some of their assets early to get ahead of some others? Currently considering Akintola for my wild card, so thoughts would be great. Thanks. Steve, let's start off this podcast with a little bit of fantasy discussion because we've had a lot of people messaging us, haven't we, about this?
Excuse me. Yes. Thank you very much for your question, Neil. We've really had a lot of interest in fantasy football this year, especially in the Eliteserien, and I think it's growing in the Swedish fantasy as well. So we thank all the fantasy players who've been in regular contact with us. And it's a good question to kick things off because I can sort of tie this in with general footballing talk as well. Have Rosenborg finally got into some form? Well, they beat Mjøndalen 3-2 and they beat Brann away 1-0. As I say, I've not yet seen the game away at Brann, but from some of the tweets that we got yesterday, it sounds like they were very, very lucky and got away with one there, winning 1-0 away from home. I don't think Erik Horneland's going to care how he gets the points at the moment. But neither victory was very convincing, especially the Mjøndalen one at home. I do believe you watched that game, John, and I have to say it was. I don't know how they beat a team, a very poor team, 3-2. I'll be honest. You know, is it? They finally got into some form. No, not for me. Is it worth getting on their assets? Is an entirely different question. But based on the last two games, there's still a lot of question marks about Rosenborg.
Yeah, and this isn't really just a fantasy question, is it? It's a general question, I suppose. The viewpoint from fantasy football is obviously, I think Neil's asking there, should he sign some of the players to his fantasy team before they go on a good run? Looking at it at the table at the moment, Steve, I mean, they are quite far behind in the race, and I did ask you this on the last show. Is there any way they can sort of still maybe win the title? You ruled them out. Have you seen anything to change your mind in the last few weeks, or are you still firmly against them?
The only thing I've seen is 6 points on the board from 2 games. And that's the only positive aspect, really. I suppose, they've ground out a couple of victories, but it's not been very convincing. Had they, thrashed a couple of teams and looked really, really good, then maybe I'd be thinking otherwise. But for the most part, they're lacking creativity. Even the 3 goals they scored against Mjøndalen, it was mostly due to mistakes from the opposition defence. The problem with the fantasy players of Rosenborg, they started the season off very expensive because obviously they're expected to do very well. Like Niklas Bentner is one of the most expensive players on the in the whole game. I mean, obviously the Eliteserien fantasy runners, they can reduce the price of these players as the season goes on. You can't reduce a player that significantly because it would be unfair on the guys who've picked him in your team. So, I mean, the ones he's mentioned, Akintola, Jensen, Berger Melling, I would say of those, Berger Melling is the one I would consider the most because Rosenborg haven't been too bad defensively, to be fair. They have kept 2 or 3 clean sheets this year, and Melling has also played on the left wing sometimes. It seems like Horneland likes him on there, even though really he's a left back, left midfielder at best. So if he's getting in advanced positions, there's more point scoring potential. So of the three players you mentioned there, I would say Melling. The positive of Mike Jensen is that he's the captain and he seems to be more motivated than most of the other players. But he's pretty expensive in comparison to the other playmakers in the league who score more goals and get more assists. So at this point in time, I can't really say jump on any of the RBK bandwagon players.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And just to clarify for maybe some who might not be familiar, David Akintola is a 23-year-old player at Rosenborg. He's had good experience in the Obos-ligaen with 8 goals in 25, and his current record in the Eliteserien is 10 goals and 6 assists in 36 games. So maybe one to consider there for the team, and in general as well. Maybe he's going to go on a bit of a run of form. Let's move on. You've suggested as well Berger Melling there as maybe one to look out for. Steve, who are the players that are in your fantasy team? I mean, I've looked at your team. You're doing pretty well. You're not quite at the top of the league, but who are the players who have done well for you so far this season that you've been relying on?
Yeah, I would say it comes down to 3 or 4 players that have done really well for me. Magnus Wolf Eikram, who I said him right at the start of the season in the pre-season podcast, and I think only about 8% of people owned him back then. I've had him as my captain most weeks, and he is the highest scoring player in the whole game, I do believe. 81 points he's racked up. Sorry, 83 points even. He's now worth 11.9 million. He started the season at 11.4. Just seeing how many actually own him now. 48% of people own him. So he's pretty much been an essential part of your team because he gets so many assists and goals and things like that. Uhi Unmoiwanfo's got me a lot of goals as well. He should have had more. He's missed 2 penalties this year. And a couple of unheralded sort of players. Amor Layuni at Buda Glimt. He had a hat-trick in one game he scored. And goalkeeper Sean McDermott has been as solid as I expected. So I would say those are the players that have done quite well for me. I've added Sturles and Bourbon as well, who have done well. But I've had a good run.
Magnus Wolf Eikram is in fact the top scoring player in the entire league by some distance as well, by 11 points. So you can see why so many, 50% of all players in the Eliteserien league in general have him in their team. So that tells you a lot about his form. Just to be clear, the second top scoring player is Alexander Stolas of Haugesund. Third is Omoiwanfo of Molde again. And then a player that I've seen mentioned a lot actually in fantasy circles this season, Amor Layuni, who you seem to quite like, don't you, Steve?
Yeah, he scored a hat-trick against, I think it was Lillestrøm a few weeks ago, and that would have got a fair chunk of his points. But he takes a lot of set pieces for Buda Glimt, and he gets an advanced position, so he's a dual threat in a lot of ways. Just on the subject of Wolf Eikram again, he's got 83 points. Only 5 other midfielders have scored more than 50 points. That is how far clear he's been of his other midfielders. So, I mean, who knows whether he can keep up this form for the rest of the season? But if you want to be up there right now, you simply had to have that player in your team right from day one, really, John. It's as simple as that.
Good, and I think I might need to sort of consider him for my team because I'm quite near the bottom of the league in that particular league. So, I may need to address that one. I've got Oe and Eikram, but for some reason, no Layuni. But let's move on. Thanks for the question, Neil, and look forward to your comments as always on the pod. I'm enjoying your polls, by the way. Steve, let's move on to something slightly different now before we maybe delve into more fantasy football talk. There's a question from @Revies Oslo, who says, "Who are the most overrated players in the Eliteserien?" And before you answer that question, give you a little bit of thinking time. Just wanted to point out I quite enjoyed @Revi Oslo's blog there. His bio, which describes himself as an experienced stout drinker. So get yourself a stout, Sylvester, and tune in for Steve's answers right now, I guess. Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I saw this question, and it's a really good one actually. And there's so many different opinions here. I guess right now you'd have to look in the Rosenborg camp, wouldn't you? And probably no further than Nicholas Bentner, if I'm being brutally honest right now. I mean, compared to his reputation, I guess the question you could ask is Bentner even rated within Norway as much anymore? I mean, worldwide, he's obviously got his reputation there. So I would have to say Nicholas Bentner. To be honest, Paul-Andre Helland isn't really performing to the level that he can either. And he's a bit of a show pony who has a certain amount of tricks, but it's the same sort of tricks. And he's a good player, don't get me wrong, but he hasn't been in very good form this year. And another Rosenborg player, I'm sorry, I'm not picking on Rosenborg here, it's just they haven't been very good. But the right back, Hedenstad, he's just someone I've never rated, even last year when they were doing well. I just don't think he's a very good right back, particularly compared to the reputation that he has. So those are the three players that spring to mind at this moment in time. Obviously, it can change a little bit, but yeah, looking at Rosenborg camp at the moment for overrated players.
Okay, Rosenborg, I mean, that kind of makes sense as they're doing so badly this season. And just to recap, obviously they're the biggest club in Norway, probably by some distance. Many would agree on that, I think. And they're currently really way down in the league. So yeah, it's been a bad season for them and Nicholas Bentner. And they're currently 10 points off the top of the table. So we shall see in 11th place. We shall see how they get on. Steve, let's move on to another question. And I think it's one that we had from a gentleman called Robert Carwardine, isn't it? And you were going to pose this one.
Yeah, this is a good one as well. Where in the English football pyramid would the winners of the Allsvenskan and Eliteserien finish?
And what are your thoughts?
Well, from a Norwegian point of view, it's a tough one, isn't it? Because I think the bottom end of the championship, if I'm being honest, for the better clubs like Molde, and if say Rosenborg were the Rosenborg of last season, I think the bottom end of the championship, maybe mid championship, potentially they could get as far as. But I mean, for some of the weaker teams, it's probably more like League One football, really. Maybe even a little bit below that, but that is my estimation of it. It's difficult to compare leagues, isn't it? I don't know what your thoughts on here, John. I mean,
yeah, we have this. Funnily enough, I spoke to a coach recently about this, and I really enjoy discussing the kind of different respective qualities of leagues. How do different leagues compare with each other? I was talking to a manager of a second division team in Norway. Assistant manager, and he was sort of saying that he felt it was in comparison with different leagues around Europe. He felt that the top end of the Norwegian league was probably roughly around the second division of Spain as a comparison. And then the third division of Spain was kind of like maybe like mid-table of the second division in Norway, which was an interesting comparison. I mean, we had an interesting comment from Daniel Cobb, who is a regular listener, and he said that he felt that it was Malmo would be kind of in the championship, in the playoffs of the championship.
The playoffs?
Yeah, which this was taken from a model by a website called 538, who are kind of a statistical analysis website. They do a lot of different things like polls for elections. I remember they got a lot of publicity around the American elections. For example, they do a lot of forecasting percentages wise. And I looked at their sort of league, and I'm not too sure, if I'm honest, if Malmo would be in the championship playoffs. Don't know what you think there, Steve.
Could you imagine Uwe Rosler outsmarting Marcelo Bielsa? Not really. No, I just think you look at the top end of the championship, and there's quite a lot of money in there, isn't there now? That's where I would say that would be where I'd be quite dubious about Malmo. I mean, you know them better than me, but perhaps they could be mid-table championship area. Feels a little bit better, but then you compare it some of the performances they have done in Europe, and maybe there would be an argument to have them a little bit higher. You can't underestimate the experience of playing in European matches, can you? So
well, I had a little look at the 538 on the back of that recommendation, and they have a global soccer club rankings. And according to those rankings, they're actually quite far down the table, Malmo. They would be ranked 115th in the world, one place below Sassuolo of Eliteserien, and one place above Beijing Guan. They were also below Aston Villa, who were in 112th. So going on those ratings, I mean, but then again, they're above Cardiff, who are 124th. So take a look at that. 538 is quite an interesting little look at their rankings. I personally think the top end of Allsvenskan is about mid-table championship. I think if you look at a player like Alexander Milosevic, who went to Nottingham Forest from Oikor, that's a pretty good level of move. I think if Pontus Jansson, for example, was to come back to Sweden from Leeds, he would go to like Malmo. He would be at the top end. You know, AIK, any of those teams would take him. He'd be a standout player in the league, and he's kind of obviously top end of the championship. So you can look at it from that point of view, really. I think teams like AIK, Malmo, possibly EF Core this season, but I'm not even sure they would do too well in a 46-game season with such a thin squad. I couldn't see them much higher than sort of 10th in the championship, maybe challenging teams like West Brom or Middlesbrough, Stoke, those kind of teams. I think it would be quite interesting, to be fair. I would like to see it happen. If there was a way of simulating it, maybe Football Manager, but I'd say around there, that's probably my answer for that question. And the lower end, I would say you're looking at possibly League One, the likes of ASC Eskilstuna. And funnily enough, this leads me to a different point, Steve, which is looking at the Superettan. Bromma Poikina are actually at bottom of the table. So they've gone from relegation in Allsvenskan to the bottom of Superettan. And this happens quite often. Another team, for example, Gefle, were relegated from Superettan last season, and then they weren't too far. You know, they were in Allsvenskan not too long ago. So there is a potential for teams going down twice, you know, and falling away. So yeah, I think the bottom of the leagues is kind of roughly maybe League One level. If anyone wants to disagree with that point, let me know. I mean, Molde were pretty far down, even further down than Malmo, weren't they, on that list, Steve?
163rd in the list, I think, were Molde down there, which is probably a little bit low. But I would say maybe 150, 140, 150 might be a little bit fairer. I mean, the bottom end of it's funny you mention like relegation. Something I often see that in France, teams that go down from Ligue 2 into the Ligue Nationale. But the problem in that league is 4 out of 16 teams get relegated. So it's quite easy to, once you're on a downward spiral, there can be problems. I mean, look at Sunderland, for example, in England. That happened with them, didn't it? So it's a harsh environment if you suddenly get a relegation. But, you know, it's... Okay.
That's a good point, actually. Just before you move on, a team like Charlton, for example, who are in League One, how would Charlton do in Allsvenskan?
Do you reckon lower end, mid-table?
I think they'd be solidly mid-table, to be honest. There's one player, for example, Joe Aribo, who's linked with Spurs and you know, big teams. I think even in the Bundesliga, he could hold his own in Allsvenskan, in my opinion, no problem at all. And you've got players there who have good experience. So, you know, that's a League One team. Some of the teams, maybe Doncaster and who got in the playoffs, and who else was in the playoffs? Portsmouth. You know, could they survive in Allsvenskan? Probably. I think probably just about. I don't think they'd have too many troubles. So, and they're a League One team. They'll have much bigger attendances than half the league. You know, so it's a good comparison, really. It does interest me a lot, this kind of debate.
Yeah.
But I think, yeah, between you know, there's no team in Allsvenskan that would hold their own in the Premier League, I don't think. And I think the Chelsea Malmo game showed that.
So I asked you a question a couple of weeks ago on the pod, John, and I asked you which team from Gothenburg would finish higher, IFK or Häcken. And the two faced off at the weekend in a derby match, and I do believe there was a dramatic conclusion to events. What did you make of this game?
Well, what a game. I think this weekend we saw two of the best games of the season so far in Allsvenskan, to be honest. Hammarby Norrköping, although there was no winner in that one. But Häcken IFK was fantastic. It was billed before the game as one of the biggest Gothenburg derbies for many years, which I think is a fair reflection, considering both teams are, in the upper echelons of the table. Obviously, with IFK's revival this season, second in the table now they are. Häcken 1 point behind them, although the defeat took them down to 5th now. But yeah, there's still, paper thin line between the two of them. It was a pulsating game, packed full house in Hisingen at the Bravida Arena, and late winner. So it was a really, really brilliant game, Steve, to be honest.
Yeah, a 96-minute winner, I do believe, from IFK, and their run just keeps going on and on, doesn't it? Their fans must be in absolute dreamland right now, and actually revenge on last year because they had some very poor results against Häcken, didn't they?
They did. They've lost their last 2 away games in that fixture. So crossing the bridge, it was a really big atmosphere for the game, and I think the game was very, very good. I think Häcken were slightly unlucky, to be honest. I think there were some decisions that didn't go their way. Sending off of Ahmed Yassin, I thought it was maybe a 50-50 red. He was sent off for an elbow, which was one of those that, was it intentional? Not sure. It was quite dangerous, but that was a bit unlucky for them. And then obviously the late sucker punch at the end. But I think they kind of played into that one. Häcken with 10 men. It was a catastrophe in terms of how they conceded that goal.
And the other game you mentioned there was the Hammarby against Norrköping 2-2 draw. I saw you tweet this earlier in the night, actually. Game of the season so far?
Yeah, it was a very good game as well. It was a packed house. I think one of the big issues in Sweden at the moment is the issue with the fans. There's a big debate at the moment in terms of the police cracking down on Swedish fans, and this is a talking point that will keep running on. But yeah, this game in particular, I mean, that's more to do with pyrotechnics and kind of what is allowed into stadiums, and there's a big debate about that in Sweden at the moment. But this game, it was played in a clean environment. What I enjoyed about the game was just the atmosphere. Both sets of fans were really, really on it. Norrköping fans, they brought a lot of fans to Stockholm. Hammarby are always good in their home stadium, always make a lot of noise. And it was a high-tempo game as well, I thought, and it swung from end to end. Hammarby kind of looked like they might snatch it, took the lead through Kjartansson with a good finish, and then it swung back towards Norrköping's way. They scored a couple of goals, Niemann and Jordan Larsson, who got a goal and an assist to continue his interesting form of late. But it was that man Tankovic, who's one of the best players in Allsvenskan at the moment, who grabbed a really, really good equaliser with a 1-2 from Kjartansson. Just a high-quality game. I thought a lot of players stepped up. Kosanu, in maybe one of his last matches, Sandberg. There was a lot of good performances from both sides. And it was an important game because although neither of them are kind of at the top of the league, they needed to, it was like a test for both of them. If they'd been a winner, it would have really have stamped their authority on the other team. I think if Norrköping had been able to win that game away, it would have relaunched their season, I think, because they've been slightly disappointing. And at one point, it did look like they would do it, but they weren't able to. Hammarby stood firm, managed to get the draw. It doesn't help either team in terms of the table itself. Both teams now are kind of 6th and 8th. But it was a good tussle.
Hammarby are actually not too far behind the race, even for the title, on 19 points there. We've got Malmö top on 24 points. We've got IFK Göteborg on 21 and Djurgården on 21 points. Going back to IFK again, and I think I asked this most weeks about their title credentials. But, this particular game against Häcken, what was the key to their success, would you say, over the 90 minutes?
Well, it said a lot about both sides. We did a poll before the game, I think, on Twitter, asking who we thought would win. And there was a few comments saying that many thought that IFK would win. And I did say in last week's show that I had doubts in terms of maybe who would finish above who. I think Hacken showed a bit of naivete, though. Like I say, I alluded to it earlier. The counter-attack to lose the game. I mean, Adam Anderson, what was he thinking? 10 men, it's the 96th minute, I think. You've got 1 minute left to get a point. You know, the team is sort of fading. Hacken win a corner, and I think they just got a bit carried away, to be honest. Everyone charged up. Anderson took a really, really poor corner. He was on as a substitute, the 22-year-old right back or left back. And the ball was headed straight back towards him in the corner. And instead of just keeping the ball and 96 minutes, Steve, against EFK, who are probably the best counter-attacking side in the league this season, the last thing you want to be doing is giving them the ball for a counter-attack in the last minute. What does he do? Whips in a cross straight to an EFK player. They go on the break, as they do, fantastically fast breaking counter-attack. Kiriishvili to Wernerson, left wing cross, Robin Soda, bang, 2-1. Good night, Vienna, 97th minute. It was a really great way to end the game, right in front of EFK's fans, who went berserk, like fans going crazy. A really good sort of derby day, late winner. And yeah, it was a really, really good game, I think. That was the key for me. I think Hacken did show a lot of glimpses. I think it's a different game. If Paulinho's there, they really missed him, I think, up front. Just his presence and his ability. I thought they got control of the game for good spells. They boxed them in the first half, EFK, after the goal. And I actually thought Hacken were looking like they were maybe a bit stronger. There was one incident, for example, Callis Sear had to make a brilliant block to deny probably what was a certain goal from Selic just before half time. Hacken were really sort of starting to box them in. But the red had an impact. I think that kind of woke up EFK, as did Yeremyev's equaliser. That kind of woke them up. They started to attack a little bit more, but it looked like it was heading for a draw. Nygren and Kiriishvili had a couple of good chances, good saves from the keeper. But like I say, that sucker punch at the end, Steve, when you switch off against the counter-attacking side, you're asking for trouble with that kind of hospital pass in the last minute that was played, and it was really, really costly in the end.
Well, I actually quite like the Hacken attitude there. You play to win the game. If they'd won that match, they'd have gone second in the table. And
they lost.
Yeah. Sometimes you've got to go for it, though, haven't you? I like that attitude, to be honest with you. If you play for draws all the time, it gets you nowhere. You're better off winning games rather than racking up draws. I mean, unless they were really, really under the cosh and it was obvious they were struggling big time, then. But yeah, I praise their attitude there.
I'm not against going for it, but if you're going to go for it, Steve, you can't give the ball away in that sort of situation for a counter attack. It cost them the game, basically. It was a poor ball straight to a midfielder, and they were right off on the counter within 10-15 seconds. Last kick of the match. For me, if you're gonna, there's nothing wrong with going for it, but you have a little bit of 1-1 draw with 10 men is not a bad result against this EFK team at this stage of the season. I think that defeat now down to 5th, and they've got bragging rights now. EFK, that's bragging rights for at least another 3-4 months.
Yeah, when you live by the sword, you die by the sword, I guess, don't you? So at the end of the day, it didn't work out for them in this instance. So they're going to have to stew on it until the return meeting. So yeah, I mean, it did sound like some sort of incredible finish to the game there. And let's move on to some of the questions. We were asked by Ted, our man Ted.
The legend. The man, the myth, the legend.
Yeah, absolute legend. Who, by the way, I liked the beard that he posted on his Twitter feed the other day. He had a poll about his beard, about whether he should cut it short or keep it long or whatever. But
well, I keep advocating for a listener of the month, don't I? And Mr. Ted Cruz, my son, is high on the list of potential listener of the month.
Transfer rumours that either of you think will happen is question, and this is an area. I mean, you're often keeping tabs on the transfer rumours of the whole world, John. But closer to home, Benjamin Nygren. Let's talk about him in the transfer. And Belgium has again come knocking, hasn't it, to an Allsvenskan club?
Yeah, and I've been brewing a rant about this for quite a while. Is it time for the rant now, Steve? Do you think? I'm not sure.
I mean, rant, go ahead. I mean, this is the place to do it.
This rant's been brewing in me for a while, and I'm not happy about this, to be honest. I think it would be catastrophic for the league. All right, there's market economics at force here. I mentioned it in our Y Scout blog about Nygren. I wrote a profile about him, which you can check out on Y Scout's page or on our Nordic Football Podcast Twitter as well. We've posted the link a few times. I've mentioned how good he is and how much potential he has, 17-year-old, but this is a concern for me, Steve, just with football in general, I think, and also with this league and Nordic leagues in general too. 15 games he's played roughly now in the league in his entire career. 15 games. It's a similar Kosnu. I mentioned it the other day. Him moving to Club Brugge. 15 games, and you're about to leave for £5 million. Fee apparently is now agreed. Everything's done between the two teams. EFK need money. Genk have money, and they're willing to pay it. So that looks like it's all done and dusted. It will secure EFK's financial future because they are in debts. They need money, not necessarily in debts, but they do need a cash injection. So this is really good for them. But I thought it was quite telling that there was a little mention in the post about it that said that it now is up to Nygren to agree personal terms. And I think I look at it as a 17-year-old boy, and I think to myself, would he actually want to leave EFK right now? You play 15 games. You know, you're nowhere near well established in terms of that club yet, but you've got the potential to be, you know, the golden child of that club for many years. You know, at least 1 year or at least 2 years. You know, you can leave when you're 19 and you've still got 10 years ahead of you for your career. You know, 15 games and you're 17. It doesn't sit right with me, Steve, I'll be honest. I think it's a worrying thing. Does he have to, you know, pulling him out of his environment? He's actually gone on record and said, I'm really happy at EFK. I love it here. I've broken into the team. This is the team I came through the academy with, you know, and I get the sense that maybe he wants to stay. I just wonder about, you know, market forces in football. Sometimes are we in a world now where people want everything too quickly? You know, we're a bit guilty of it as well. We've bigged him up, of course. We've talked about him. You know, I've been very excited about his potential, but you know, 15 games, is it really ready for him to move on? My worry with it, Steve, is he becomes maybe another case of a player who moves abroad. You know, he's not going to be the golden child of Genk. He's just going to be another signing and at quite a cost. Is he going to, you know, get the same treatment, the same care? All right, football-wise, maybe he gets more development, but you know, is there a risk that in a year's time he's back in EFK and kind of a bit of a busted flush? You know, it risks his reputation, I think. And I just wonder, should things be more gradually done, Steve, in football in general? And is there a way of maybe making that so? Because it's just, I think for EFK as well, it'd be a real shame if they lost him at this stage. And I think for us as a podcast and as a league, and I'm going on a little bit here, but it would be a shame too.
And the two things that I've got to mention here, I think, what happened to the cases of where a club buys, say a big club buys someone and then loans him back for what I call a really long-term loan, say a year and a half? You don't seem to hear of too many of those anymore, do you? It's obvious that the player would rather be in Gothenburg for the foreseeable future. There's no reason why he couldn't be loaned back at least for the rest of this season. The way you could protect these players is to bring in a law where they cannot transfer abroad until they're a higher age, perhaps from a club anyway. That's a possibility. I think, is it Brazil have something? I don't know the exact laws down there, but I think there are some countries where you can't get your hands on these kids until quite an older age. You certainly can't get them while they're 16. I know that in some of them.
I mean, there are laws in terms of FIFA's regulations on transfers, dictated around 18-year-olds as well. There have to be certain reasons for transfers. But I think it's not only necessarily the fact that he's an under 18 player. I think it's just about football in general, in my opinion. You know, there's a situation in football where the market is dictated by the teams with the financial power, and I feel as if there's almost too much now of a whirlwind. We live in a social media age. We live in a sort of hype generation where we hype things up so much. And I think that can kind of, I think sometimes you have to take a step back. I mean, this is not only a Allsvenskan problem or Nordic problem. There's players in England who are 22 and have been written off as failures. I'll give you a good example of this. Marcus Rashford, for example. People are sort of saying he's not good enough now. I've seen comments about him ridiculing him. The guy's 21. He's actually scored more goals than Alan Shearer had at Alan Shearer's stage of his career. And yet, in the eyes of some, Rashford is kind of like a flop. To me, it's just, there's that. It's almost as if we get bored of players now quickly. There's too much of that arc of people criticized Game of Thrones, didn't they, about the characters and how they didn't get enough time to get that character arc to blossom as characters. And I think there's a similarity in football in a way. There's not enough time for these players to kind of develop at their home clubs or at their current clubs without the level of judgment. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. There's not enough time for these players to develop either in their own club or their own country. In my opinion, there's no harm in staying in your own country, even if it is a smaller nation, until you're about 20, really. It works in the past for players, didn't it? It's the problem. It's all a business, right? Genk, I'm not even sure they will be thinking that Benjamin Nygren is going to be a long-term player for them. You know what they're looking to do? They're looking to make a profit on that player. They're looking to get like 1 or 2 good years out of him. Then someone comes in for, say, 15, 20 million. It's all about business, isn't it? And the reason that they want to get on these players early is because they fear other clubs snapping him up instead.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at Genk, they've just won the league in Belgium. Who is he going to replace in that team? I'll be honest, I haven't looked at their squad, so it's maybe I'm being a bit premature here. Maybe they have a great place for him. But, if you look at the history of Belgian players in Sweden, Swedish players in Belgium who come back quite quickly, Buya Touré being a great example of that. He was back within, less than a year. That's my worry about it, really. I just think, is there a pathway for Nygren? The thing to bear in mind is he's a very, very good player. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with that, in the sense of, obviously, fair enough. If they really have a pathway for him, then fine. But I think one of the other things about that Häcken game, Steve, that I just want to point out before we move on, is he was taken off after 75 minutes in that game. He didn't actually really play that well. He had one good chance, good shot, but he wasn't really that great. So if you really look at it, he's still a kid growing into his own body, into his own kind of environment. He's still not an established first-team player, in my opinion. You're not established till you've played at least 3/4 of a season, for me. So he's really not actually established in Allsvenskan yet, let alone to say he's going to move on to a new league. He wasn't good in that game compared to most of the other players. Interestingly enough, he's been left out of the Sweden under-21 squad. And the reason for it given was that he needs a breather. He needs some time to relax and recuperate. And I thought that was quite telling as well. That hints to you that this is a player who hasn't really established himself. He still needs a break. He's still finding his feet. So to be leaving the league already and whisked away just seems premature to me.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think what a player like that needs, with the next club he moves to, he needs a lot of playing time. Not like ridiculous amounts, but he needs significant number of minutes in order to develop. What's the point of being on the bench all the time, or not even being in the match squad at a club like Genk? Genk, for fuck's sake, it's ridiculous. Anyway, so let's have a break now, and we'll talk about some other things afterwards. So Allsvenskan fantasy, probably a bit more fantasy talk in Norway as well, and maybe some other issues that are going on over there in Norway. So we'll see you soon.
Welcome back to the Nordic Football Podcast. My name is Jonathan Fadugba, and I'm joined by my co-host Steve Wyss. We're going to move on to some talk about Norway now and the goings-on in the latest round of action. Steve, there was a shock result in the Oslo derby, I believe.
Yeah, and you've just had your rant, and this is probably going to be my rant on this podcast. And surprise, surprise, it's about Vålerenga again. I've ranted about them before, and here I come again, because they're the most bloody annoying side out there. They look so good in recent weeks anyway. and suddenly they throw in an absolute stinker against Lillestrøm at home. They're bitter rivals. Was that 3-0? It was
to Lillestrøm.
Yeah, away from home, great victory for them. Yeah, I never saw this result coming in a million years, to be honest with you. I thought Vålerenga would absolutely thrash them, to be honest. And they started well enough, but they just got ahead of themselves with missing chances. Fitim Azimi, I mean, you talk about overrated players. He's right up there as well. He's an absolute waste of space up front. Absolute shit heap at the moment. Could not finish his dinner right now. Absolutely sick of him. I don't know why Ronny Deila continues to play him when there's other options on the bench like Bård Finner or even a couple of talented youngsters who could do a better job than him. And he actually got sent off in this game just to complete his misery. Couldn't score in a brothel right now, Azimi, I have to say. Absolutely useless.
All right, we get your point. We get the point.
Useless. But the whole team seemed to be very slack mentally. It was as if they weren't taking Lillestrøm seriously. The goalkeeper made a stupid error early on, unbelievable error actually, to let in the first goal. And from that point onwards, they were mentally rocked. And I've said it before that this team doesn't have a strong enough backbone if they get their backs to the wall. You know, they're not the sort of team that can grind out a result. It's either they're brilliant or just shite, really. And it was the latter that, one bad... It was a bit like the goal... You remember the Leeds Derby playoff where the Leeds keeper conceded that goal right on half-time. It was the type of goal that was conceded that just rocked their minds, but they had no mental capacity to come back into it. At the same time, I suppose I've got to give Lillestrøm a lot of credit, and especially from a defensive point of view, they were quite solid. Salquist was especially good there. But, an unbelievable result. And I don't think anyone really saw this one coming. It just shows you that in a derby match, the form book really can be thrown completely out the window because this went completely against what anyone would have expected.
Yeah, I mean, we don't talk about Lillestrøm that often, to be fair. But they had a player who scored 2 goals, didn't they, up front? A player by the name of, is it Thomas Olsen, I believe?
Yeah, Thomas Lene Olsen, who is actually one of the highest scoring fantasy strikers. He's not my sort of player, I've got to be honest. He's more of a target man type who he's not bad technically. He's good enough. It's just he has a knack of being in the right place at the right time, but I don't really rate him that highly. But he does get a few goals, to be fair to him. I think probably, the biggest part of his game is his brain, really, just allowing him to drifts into right positions, like I say. But at the same time, he wouldn't be the first name on my team sheet, personally. But fair play to him, he cleaned up twice. Real poacher, not a fox in the box type as such, but delivered it. And, they won this game because they were better tactically. They were better mentally, and they certainly got their little bit of luck with the first goal, the keeper mistake, but they capitalised on it, and you've got to give a team a lot of credit for that. In
another game, Molde, their away woes continued, didn't they? Because they've lost to the bottom team in the league, Tromsø.
Well, this is really an unbelievably bizarre result.
What was the score?
2-1 to Tromsø. I mean, Molde should have won this game, no doubt about it. They had enough chances. I think expected goals was 3.20 against 0.52. But Tromsø scored after 35 seconds, I do believe, and then they went 2-0 up just after half-time. A pivotal point was Tromsø got reduced to 10 men, and then they were given a penalty. Molde got a penalty at about 51st minute, and Ui Umowanfo missed it. And it's another little bit of a rant coming from me now. I don't want to criticise Ui because he's scored a lot of goals this year and put in some great performances, but he has missed 2 penalties. And the way I don't think he's a very good penalty taker. I think a lot of goalkeepers can read his action. And if you look at where he goes with the ball, he's always looking to strike it high into the net, often into the top left corner or top centre. He's not going to give you a little cute Panenka or, something into the bottom right or low. And it's quite choreographed, I think, at times. You can you can see where he's going. So I think Molde have got to seriously consider changing to a different penalty taker. Someone's a bit more cuter, if you ask me. It didn't cost him in the first game he missed a penalty in. but it definitely cost them there, because if they made it 2-1 with 35, 40 minutes left against 10 men, you would have expected them to at least draw the game. But they've had problems away from home. They've lost against Kristiansund away, Buda Glimt away. Yeah, they're not travelling very well. It's a good job. They're absolutely brilliant at home, John. I'll say that. And they can probably get away with some of these defeats because of the rest of the competition this year. But they won't want to make a habit of it.
That's a worry for anyone who owns OE in their fantasy team, me being one of them, missing a couple of penalties there. Who would you have as your penalty taker?
Well, the Wolf, to be honest with you. He takes all other set pieces, doesn't he? So I would have him on there. Eric Ulland Anderson, when he's fit, he's injured at the moment. When he's fit, he's definitely one who could take a penalty. And Mulder are full of good technical players who I'm sure who could step up to the mark. But for me, Uwe, it's about he's going for sort of power, but at the same time a weird sort of power. And, I don't want to knock the guy because you can't judge someone on penalties, but I think they've really got to think about replacing him, because it will cost them in a really big game at some point this year.
Interesting, yeah. I mean, moving on to Tromsø just briefly, in 538's global football rankings, they are number 546 in the world, just below Grenoble and one place above Maritzburg United of South Africa. Bizarrely enough, I don't understand this, but Bristol Rovers and Fleetwood Town are 20 places above them, and somehow Fleetwood Town and Bristol Rovers are ranked higher than Auxerre, and one place below Lillestrøm, funnily enough. But Steve, on to Tromsø. Just want to come back to Ted Cruz ate my son's question there, because on the transfer rumour front, there is a big rumour about one of their players who was watched by a Dutch side called Heerenveen, a big Eredivisie team, this week, and that player is Espisode. What can you tell us about this player, Runar Espisode at Tromsø? And given that they're sort of 540th odd in the world rankings, are they a sort of team that might need to sell him?
Just going back to them rankings very quickly, I think Grenoble would spank all of those teams that we mentioned. Silly, to be honest. I have no idea why they're so low. But Runar Espisode is a player. Yeah, I've always rated him. I've mentioned him on this podcast. Last year he was one of my 10 to watch. But injury is an issue with this striker. He's a good finisher. I'll give him that. That is the main thing to like about him.
What position is he, just for those who might not know?
An out-and-out number 9 striker.
Right.
Who's pretty good technically. I wouldn't say he's a clinical finisher, but he's a natural finisher, if you know what I mean. And he's got good pace, strength. He's sort of average. Positional play is quite good. He can get in there. Good all-round sort of striker. But injury, he's a player that needs to be wrapped in cotton wool. He's never been able to, play more than 20 matches in the whole season. Something always seems to strike up with him. So any team that buys him would have to realise that he is an injury risk. He might not be a bad option, actually, I mentioned earlier, it's not very good to have a striker come in or a player come in and just sit on the bench all the time. Well, actually, he wouldn't maybe be a bad bench option for a team like Heerenveen or a bigger club. Come on and make an impact in the last 20, 25 minutes of a match. It could be a good move for the club, for Heerenveen, the buying club in that sense. The player himself, it might not be the worst move either, because he clearly can't last the whole year as a 90-minute striker every week. So a good move there. And Tromsø have made it publicly clear that they need the money. They've needed money for the last 3 or 4 years, full stop. So they can't be turning down any offer. In fact, some of the recent sales were quite cheap, I thought, when they loaded off Mikkel Inge Brixen to Göteborg. I think it was only like 100,000, which at that point, I know he flopped there, but that point, it seemed ridiculously cheap. So I do hope that they get a good price for him if he does end up being sold. Good player.
Thanks for that, Steve. Yeah, just to point out there that, Heerenveen's directors, I believe, were at the game watching him, Espisode. He's number 17 in the list of fantasy football scorers in terms of points this season so far, with 20 points, only owned by 1.9% of players. But Yeah, looks like an interesting one there. Maybe that's a bit of a coup for them, and Tromsø could get a bit of money in for them. How are they doing in general since we interviewed their manager on a podcast?
They've had a poor season, to be brutally honest. They've not done very well at all. Bottom of the table. I think there were 3 straight games where they took the lead and ended up losing matches. So I don't think anyone expected them to get anything against Molde. So to win that match is a big bonus. Well done to Simo Valakari up there. Pleased for him. Pleased for the club and the players. That they're a team. I always said that in the last podcast, I said I don't think they'll go down. Just give them a bit of time. But I certainly expected them to need the 3 weeks off before they found some sort of results. So yes, right. We talked about Norwegian fantasy a bit earlier, but now let's move on to the Allsvenskan fantasy. And there is obviously a Nordic football podcast league which we would like you to join. Give you the join code in a minute, but there's in terms of the actual league itself. There's one player that's been significantly higher than anyone else throughout the whole campaign, and that is a team called Nips versus Swedes. 680 points on the board. He's the 13th highest ranked player in the whole competition. That is including everyone in the whole Allsvenskan fantasy, let alone the Nordic Football Podcast League. In terms of players that have done very well this year, John, which ones would you say have been absolutely essential?
Yeah, and just quickly on Nips versus Swedes, he's the Malmo of this league, isn't he? He's running away with it. I took a look at his team in fact, just to see what he's doing, and he's got a double game week captain this week of 2 Malmo players, and I think between them he's already racked up about 50 points. He's obviously using his cards very well. Malmo beating AFC Eskilstuna 5-0, and they have another game coming up against GIF Sundsvall, so you would expect them to rack up more points there. Malmo are doing really well, and we've got an exclusive interview coming up in the next few weeks with someone at Malmo, which we will dig into and give you more details about in future episodes. But keep an eye out for that one if you're a Malmo supporter. Key players in the Allsvenskan fantasy. Well, I'm not sure I'm one to talk, to be honest, because I'm having a bit of a mare this season. I've missed a couple of deadlines for changing players, which has set me back a little bit. But for me, it's difficult to look past the man, Muo Matankovic, at this moment in time. He's owned by 43% of the league, so he's not exactly a hidden gem here, but 74 points. He's the top scoring midfielder in the league, doing really, really well this season. I think you have to be careful, Steve, now when you're looking at fantasy with the upcoming transfer window. We've got one more round left until the summer break, and I think that has to be kept in mind because we're going to have players like maybe Nygren, as we've mentioned just there. Tankovic might be another one who may be on the market, and that's going to be something to think about. In terms of the top scoring players, I'll run through them very quickly. Top scoring goalkeeper is Abrahamsson of Bækkåhaken, 56 points, only owned by 14% of teams. Daniel Sundgren, AIK, he's on penalties there and he's a defender, so 40% of teams have clocked onto him and he's returned 67 points for them. A fairly hefty price of 7.2, but still, he's doing the business. Tankovic, as I mentioned, top scoring midfielder. And then in attack, this is an interesting one. Tarek El Yunusi, who's flown into the lead now, the 67 points. Only owned by 18.3% of the league because of maybe his poor start to the campaign. Jeremiev of Bækkåhaken scored against the IFK this weekend, and he's second in that list with 23% ownership. But El Yunusi is the main man at this moment in time.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about Jeremiev. I might just call him Jeffrey. He's a player that's caught my eye. If you had to choose between him or Paulinho, would you be going with Jeremiev?
Do you mean in fantasy terms or just
in fantasy terms?
Well, Jeremiev is 9.6 million, and Paulinho I think is well over 10.
Yeah.
So if you look at the return in terms of points as well, yeah, it's a no-brainer really. Both of them tend to start, when fit. Paulinho's had a few injuries this season, so he's not played every game. Jeremiev is one of those players who is a bit of a poacher. He's a bit of a kind of, I wouldn't go as far as sort of Harry Kane, but he does tend to sort of, a good example was this Göteborg derby. Didn't really do a great deal, I didn't think, in that match, but came up with a, clinical header, lost his man, and it was poor marking, in fact, but, got his goal, got his points. Paulinho is more of an all-rounder, really. He's the kind of player who, if you captain him on a certain week, and he could hit you a hat-trick. He's that kind of player. He plays in bursts. But he's a very, very costly player. So I think that's why I've swerved him, to be honest. I've got Buya Toure, Nygren and Kjartansson. But I'm not really one to talk. I think Mr. Neats v Swedes might have to come on the show and talk about that.
Yeah, I've had a bit of a poor run myself in this fantasy. My debut year, of course, in the league, so there were no high expectations. But my captain got sent off this week, so rather sums up my luck. The Allsvenskan fantasy. But you were mentioning about the transfer window. Would you suggest to players in the second half of the season to save their wild card until after all the the transfer window is shut?
Yeah, certainly. I think at this stage now, with one game left, it's probably worth it. If you look at the upcoming games, there's IFK against Örebro, so people might want to be looking at IFK assets for the weekend home game. You'd expect them to win against a pretty poor Örebro side. AFC Eskilstuna always tend to struggle at this. They're not having a good season, really, are they? But they've got the cup final coming up. And in terms of the league, they're playing Norrköping, so maybe Jordan Larsson, who is a bit of a hit and miss player, but I think he has got good value at sort of 7 million there, 50 points. I think he's one to look at. But yeah, I'm personally keeping my wild card. I'm going to look at it and reassess over the transfer window. But I think, like I say, Mr. Neats v Swedes, and maybe I'm not one to talk at this moment in time. But certainly Jordan Larsson is appealing to me at this stage with 50 points and only 15% ownership.
And you can join the Nordic Football podcast, Allsvenskan Fantasy League. The code needed to join is 21230/4097. I think we've got about 30 odd players in that league. Let's see if we can get over 50 by the end of the season. And the code to join the Eliteserien Fantasy League, 28465/8596. We've got a lot of players in that league. Thanks for your support there. So keep the questions coming, guys, on fantasy, and we'll do our best to answer them. But I think that's pretty much it for this episode, John. I don't know if we've left any other questions, although there was one other question that I did want to answer regarding Sarpsborg. I'm trying to find it now, but I don't know if there's anything else.
Interstate FC at Interstate FC on Twitter says, I've been rooting for Sarpsborg this season. Should I prepare for relegation or glory?
I think my answer is neither. You're not going to get any glory, let's just say that, unless they win the Norwegian Cup. And I just don't see them getting into any European spots either. So there's more chance of relegation, but realistically, a mediocre campaign where, you sort of mid-table, maybe some form and results may well come back into that. So, yeah, thanks very much for your question at Interstate FC there. And keep following Sarpsborg.
They've only scored 7 goals in the entire campaign so far in 9 games, which is only Stabæk have a worse record. So maybe not too much entertainment there in terms of in the Sarpsborg ranks. But good question there, and thanks for that, Interstate FC. Just remember that you can follow us on Twitter at Nordic Footpod and give us a like on Facebook too, Nordic Football Podcast. I think we're pretty much done for the show. One thing I wanted to quickly say on transfers, and this goes back to the Benjamin Nygren point just very, very quickly, and fantasy football too, in fact. Sead Haksabanovic, who was in many people's fantasy football teams at the start of the season in Sweden, has not played for the last 6 games in a row now, Steve. And I'm going to leave you with this one as maybe something to think about. What was the value of his West Ham transfer when he transferred from Halmstad, went to West Ham, barely played, was loaned out a few times, is now back in Allsvenskan and now hasn't played for 6 games running? Is that kind of what awaits Benjamin Nygren's future? And it's a bit of a food for thought, really, there in general, isn't it? But yeah, he's been ditched, and he's been ditched from my team and many others too.
He started in my team as well, the cursed Meatman Soccer fantasy team. What was the transfer fee? to West Ham?
It was about £3 million.
Was it that much? It just shows.
Yeah.
And it
he was very, very good at Halstead, to be fair. But like I say, it was, this was over 3 or 4 months.
You can regress as a player, can't you? That's the problem, mentally and physically. And we do hope that it doesn't happen the same to Benjamin Nygren.
Definitely not. I think that's all we have time for on this show. Thanks to everyone who's offered your questions. I think we've had more questions on this pod than we've had for many, many weeks previous. So that's why we've gone for a bit of a question-led podcast today. We'll be back, of course, with some analysis up to and including the summer breaks. We'll be talking about some of the best players in the leagues and plenty more. But for now, I think that's all we have time for. And this is the point where we say goodbye. Thanks for listening, everyone. From me, Jonathan Fadugba, my colleague Steve Wyss at Meatman Soccer. Thanks and goodbye.